Introduction to Theology, Part 3. And today we're looking at the area of theology called theology proper. Some say proper theology, but it's just looking at the figure of God. Now this is the central pillar of any theistic system of thought. And what that means is that what you think about God has dramatic effects on everything else in the system, including how you act. So, the study of God is actually very, very, very important. The most important, one might say. Now, people, when they study God, they like to start with showing God exists. And for showing God exists, they have rational arguments for God's existence. And these might include the following, like cosmological arguments, which proceed from some aspect of existence, concluding to a necessary being. They might look at design arguments, which proceed from the appearance of design and conclude about an intelligent creator. They might use moral arguments, which proceed from the nature of moral facts to a moral lawgiver. They might use historical arguments, or looking at miracles and seeing what they prove about God, or ontological arguments that proceed from the nature of being, or the very concept of God as a necessary being. And that's by no means an exhaustive list. And we could open up each of those to see that these are whole families of very similar arguments, each with their own premises. But we're not going to focus on this. We're going to instead focus on the picture of God provided in the Old Testament to find out what a Jew of Jesus' time would think about God. And ultimately, what Jesus thought about God himself, since he was in that context. So, the story of the Old Testament is the story of one man and his descendants, and their encounters with God throughout their history. As Israel experienced what God does, they gave testimonies of what God is like. So in this next section, we'll explore what God does and what God is like in the Old Testament. To begin, what does God do? God is the God who creates. The Bible begins with a chapter that celebrates the power and sovereignty of God to bring about and order all that there is. All commentators agree about the concern of these early chapters of the Bible to universalize Israel's faith. Well, God wasn't just the deity for Israel, but he was the God for the whole universe. And reflections on God as the Creator are mentioned throughout the Scriptures, including Isaiah 45. Here, faith in Yahweh is able to be maintained in the face of exile and supposed abandonment by God, because he, being the Creator of all, is greater than the gods of the Babylonians. The book of Proverbs also reflects on God as the Creator, emphasizing the wisdom and insight necessary to bring about creation. Secondly, God is the God who promises. In Genesis 22, it says, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord." So in making a covenant with Abraham, having no one greater than himself to swear to, God swears by himself. The promises he makes here are woven through the rest of the Old Testament for confirmation, a promise regarding the land and Abraham's descendants being blessed. Third, God is the God who delivers. God ensures his promises are not frustrated by human rebellion. Now, Israel's deliverance from Egypt became the standard of God's faithfulness. In later days of distress, Israel is called to remember and retell this story that celebrates God's role as deliverer, including at the Jordan and during the exile. Number 4, God is the God who commands. Now, the primal command of Yahweh is exclusive loyalty to Him. And in Exodus, at the beginning of the Decalogue, it says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And of course, the Torah is the book of law, where commandments dominate Exodus 19 through Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy. It dictates all of life for Israel, including how to relate to Him, to others, and even strangers outside of Israel. In Leviticus 19 verse 1 it says, Be holy, because I, the Lord, your God, am holy. Now this is the foundational statement for the rest of the Levitical law, which is the priestly and sacrificial machinery that spell out what it means for Israel to be holy. So the standard of right living is Yahweh's own character. And fifth, God is the God who provides. Both in their journey out of Egypt and into the promised land, God is the one who provided for and guided the nation. He provided manna, quail, water, protection, a cloud and pillar of fire for guidance, as well as His own presence. So, from these testimonies of what God has done for the nation, they were able to say what God is like with adjectives and metaphors. And these were reflections on who Yahweh was to them based upon what He did for them. So, to look at some examples of adjectives in Exodus 34, verse 6 to 7. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Lamentations begins with despair, recounting the tragedy of the fall of Jerusalem. The lamenter says, So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. But then, when he turns to focus on the characteristics of Yahweh, he gains confidence and hope. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope, he says. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for Him. And then intimate terms are employed to tell of the love and care of Yahweh and His tenacious, radical fidelity towards Israel in Hosea 3:19 to 23. And I will take you for my wife forever. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. Then there are the biblical metaphors that explain what God is. Two categories of metaphors emerge: to explain His rulership, and another to explain the constancy of His care. Firstly, the metaphors of governance, where Yahweh is as judge. So Yahweh is committed to a rule of just law. So those who need protection and justice can turn to Him. He loves justice and intervenes on behalf of His people. Exodus 34 verse 7 says, Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. And on the basis of Yahweh being the judge of nations, individuals are to appeal to Yahweh's righteousness, as in Psalms 7. Yahweh as king. Now the judge and the king are closely related to each other because the highest guarantor of order and justice is the king. But Yahweh is not only the king of Israel, but of the whole cosmos. Now the next two metaphors are present, although they're not really emphasized as much. It's Yahweh as warrior and Yahweh as a father. Metaphors of sustenance include an artist. In Jeremiah 18:6 says, "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does?" Of a healer in Exodus 15:26, "For I am the Lord who heals you." As a vine dresser or a gardener, Isaiah 5:7, "The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel." And mother in Isaiah 66:13, "As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you." Now this aspect here isn't greatly emphasized, but the fact is there and it can't be ignored. You might say that this feminine metaphor doesn't really add anything that isn't already there in the picture of God as a father. But it is meant to be reassuring or comforting, and it is that. And it does prove useful in providing a response to sexism. And then finally, Yahweh as a shepherd, Psalms 23. We all know, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Now these are the metaphors of governance and sustenance found in the Old Testament. And from them, Israel could make generalizations about how God would continue to act. By them, Israel had great cause for hope, despite the often desperate circumstances they found themselves in. The Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann summarizes here. But because the Old Testament does not and never intends to provide a coherent and comprehensive offer of God, this subject matter is more difficult, complex, and problematic than we might expect. For the most part, the Old Testament gives us only hints, traces, fragments, and vignettes, with no suggestion of how all these elements might fit together, if indeed they do. What does emerge, he goes on, is in any case, is an awareness that the elusive but dominating subject of the Old Testament cannot be comprehended in any preconceived categories. The God of the Old Testament does not easily conform to the expectations of Christian dogmatic theology, nor to the categories of any Hellenistic perennial philosophy. It includes the character who will emerge from such a patient study at the end will still be elusive and more than a little surprising. So though the Old Testament provides us some good information on God, it's clear that we still have much to learn. In the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, what effectively happened was that the names of God in Hebrew were wiped out and replaced with the Greek word Lord. And the New Testament adds three aspects to the understanding of God: an emphasis on God as the Father, an emphasis on God as the King, and then a plurality of God in God emerges, which was the beginning of the Trinitarian doctrine. And that, dear friends, is the first lecture, an introduction to theology.
So you say the quantity of how God is described emphasizes more of an aspect of his character? You said that he was described as more as a judge and more as a king, and less as a
Yes, well,
warrior.
Yeah, there are. There's quantity. There's less mentions of God as a mother, for instance, than there are as God as a king or a judge. And so, yes, the Bible, or the Old Testament in particular, has an emphasis. For instance, you can consider the first 5 books are the books of the law, the Torah. And so, of course, you have this emphasis on God as a judge, or God as a rule giver.